Hey everybody, this is the third video of part 3, chapter 1 of Adorno's Negative Dialectics. Part 3 is titled Models. Chapter 1 is titled Freedom on the Metacritique of Practical Reason. And the headings in this video are Objectivity in the Antinomy, Dialectical Definition of the Will, and Contemplation. So let's fucking rock. Objectivity in the Antinomy. According to Kant, both the assertion of freedom and that of unfreedom terminate in contradictions. Hence the controversy is called fruitless. Hypostatizing scientific methodical criteria, Kant propounds it as self-evident. The theorems which cannot be safeguarded from the possibility of their contradictory antithesis should be discarded in rational thinking. After Hegel, this has been no longer tenable. The contradiction may lie in the thing itself. It may not, from the start, be attributable to procedure. The urgency of the concern with freedom suggests such objective contradictoriness. Kant, in demonstrating the necessity of the antinomies, disdained using the quote, pseudo-problem quote, as an excuse, but was quick to bow to the logic of non-contradictoriness. Footnote, quote, for that which must needs impel us to go beyond the bounds of experience, and of all phenomena it is unconditionality. And of all phenomena is unconditionality, Jesus Christ, which reason necessarily and rightly requires of things in themselves, along with all that is conditioned, and thus completing the sequence of conditions. If it now turns out, assuming that our empirical cognition goes by the objects as things in themselves, that without contradiction, the unconditional cannot be thought at all. And if, on the other hand, assuming that our conception of things as they are given to us does not go by these things as they are in themselves, but that these objects as phenomena go by our mode of conception rather, it turns out that the contradiction disappears, and that unconditionality will accordingly not be encountered in things when we know them, when they are given to us. But if we do not know them, it will indeed be encountered in them as things in themselves. If this is the outcome, it shows our merely tentative initial assumption to be well-founded. End quote. Kant, Kritik der reinen Vernunft. Works 3. End footnote. The Kantian transcendental dialectics is not wholly unaware of this. It is present, of course, as a dialectics of sophistries after the Aristotelian model. But each thesis as well as each antithesis is non-contradictorily developed in itself. The antitheticality is not comfortably dismissed by any means. The point is rather to demonstrate its inevitability. It is said to be, quote, soluble, end quote, only at a higher stage of reflection, as the hypostasis of logical reason toward things of whose being in itself it is ignorant, and on which it is therefore not entitled to pass positive judgments. That the contradiction is inescapable for human reason indicates that it is beyond that reason and its, quote, logic. Substantially, this permits it to be possible for the carrier of reason, the subject, to be both free and unfree. Kant uses the means of undialectical logic to settle the contradiction by distinguishing between the pure subject and the empirical subject, a distinction in which the interrelation of the two concepts is disregarded. The subject is to be unfree insofar as it is its own object, and thus subjected to a lawful synthesis by the categories. To be able to act in the empirical world, the subject can indeed not be conceived otherwise than as a, quote, phenomenon, end quote, and Kant certainly would not always deny this. The work on practical reason concurs with the work on the pure one in teaching that speculative criticism grants, quote, to the objects of experience as such, and to our own subject among them, only the validity of phenomena, end quote. Synthesis, the mediating process, cannot be subtracted from anything we positively judge, as the unifying moment of the thought it covers its every content and determines its necessity. Even the talk of a strong ego as a firm identity, as the condition of freedom, would share that fate. It would have no power over the truismos. In a Kantian sense, the objectification of character could be localized only in the realm of the constituum, not in that of the constituens. Otherwise, Kant would be committing the same paralogism of which he convicts the rationalists. The subject is to be free, however, as it posits, quote, constitutes, end quote, in Kant's language, its own theory, the basis of its legality, that the constituens is to be the transcendental subject, and the constitutum, the empirical one, does not remove the contradiction, for there is no transcendental subject other than one individualized as a unit of consciousness. In other words, as a moment of the empirical subject. The transcendental subject needs the irreducible non-identity, which simultaneously delimits the legality. Without that non-identical element, there would be neither identity nor an immanent law of subjectivity. Only for non-identity is this a law, otherwise it is a tautology. The identifying principle of the subject is itself the internalized principle of society. This is why in the real subjects, in social beings, unfreedom ranks above freedom to this day. Within a reality modeled after the principle of identity, there exists no positive freedom. Where men under the universal spell seem inwardly relieved of the identity principle, and thus of the comprehensible determinants, they are not more than determined. For the time being, they are less than determined. As schizophrenia, subjective freedom is a destructive force which incorporates men only so much more in the spell of nature. New section. Dialectical definition of the will. A will without physical impulses, impulses that survive, weakened, weak-ended in imagination would not be a will. At the same time, however, the will settles down as the centralizing unit of impulses, as the authority that tames them and potentially negates them. This necessitates a dialectical definition of the will. It is the force that enables consciousness to leave its own domain, and so to change what merely exists. Its recoil is resistance. Unquestionably, memories of this have always accompanied the transcendental rational ethics, as in the Kantian avowal of a given moral law, independent of philosophical consciousness. For example, Kant's thesis is heteronymous and authoritarian, but it has an element of truth in its restriction of the purely rational character of the moral law. Strictly speaking, the one reason could be none but the unimpaired philosophical reason. The motif culminates in Fichte's formula that, quote, the moral aspect is always self-understood, end quote. As the bad conscience of its rationality, however, the will's irrationality becomes crumpled and false. Once it is held to be self-understood, excused from rational reflection, the self-understood character offers a refuge to the unelucidated remnant and to repression. To be self-understood is the mark of civilization. Good, we say, is what is one, what is immutable, what is identical. What does not comply, any heritage of the pre-logical natural moment, will immediately turn into evil, into something as abstract as the principle of its opposite. Bourgeois evil is the post-existence of older things, of things that have been subdued, but not wholly subdued. Yet this evil is not absolutely evil, no more so than its violent counterpart. Each time the judgment can only be made by a consciousness that will reflect the various moments insofar, and as consistently as it has access to them. For the right practice and for the good itself, there really is no other authority than the most advanced state of theory. When an idea of goodness is supposed to guide the will without fully absorbing the concrete rational definitions, it will unwittingly take orders from the reified consciousness, from that which society has approved. A will detached from reason and proclaimed as an end in itself, like the will whose triumph the Nazis certified in the official title of their party congresses, such a will, like all ideals that rebel against reason, stand ready for every misdeed. Goodwill may be self-understood, but in the mirage it grows obdurate, a historic sediment of the power which the will ought to resist. In contrast to its Pharisaism, the irrational moment of the will condemns all moral aspects to fallibility as a matter of principle. There is no moral certainty. Its mere assumption would be immoral, would falsely relieve the individual of anything that might be called morality. The more mercilessly an objective antagonistic society will comport itself in every situation, the less can any single moral decision be warranted as the right decision. Whatever an individual or a group may undertake against the totality they are part of is infected by the evil of the totality, and no less infected is he who does nothing at all. This is how original sin has been secularized. The individual who dreams of moral certainty is bound to fail, bound to incur guilt, because, being harnessed to the social order, he has virtually no power over the conditions whose cry for change appeals to the moral ingenium. It is for such decay, not of morality, but of the, quote, moral aspect, end quote, that the clever Neo-German language, after World War II, hatched the name, quote, over-demanding, end quote, an apologetical instrument of its own. All conceivable definitions of the moral aspect, down to the most formal, the unity of self-consciousness qua reason, were squeezed out of that, quote, matter with which moral philosophy did not want to dirty its hands. Today, morality has been restored to the heteronomy morality loathes, and its tendency is to void itself. Without recourse to the material, no aught could issue from reason. Yet once compelled to acknowledge its material in the abstract as a condition of its own possibility, reason must not cut off its reflection on the specific material. Precisely this would make it heteronomous. Looking back, we see the positivity of the moral aspect, the infallibility which the subjective idealist attested to that aspect, unveiled as a function of a society still more or less closed, or at least of the appearance of such a society for a consciousness confined in it. This is what Benjamin may have meant by the conditions and limits of humanity, the primacy called for in the doctrines of Kant and Fichte, that of practical reason over theory, actually of reason over reason, applies only to traditionalist phases whose horizon does not even admit the doubts which the idealists dreamed of resolving. New section, contemplation. Marx received the thesis of the primacy of practical reason from Kant and the German idealists, and Marx sharpened it into a challenge to change the world instead of merely interpreting the world. He thus underwrote something as arch-bourgeois as the program of an absolute control of nature. What is felt here is the effort to take things unlike the subject and make them like the subject, the real model of the principle of identity, which dialectical materialism disavows as such. Yet as he extroverts the concept's immanent reality, Marx prepares for a recoil. The telos of due practice, according to him, was the abolition of the primacy of practice in the form that had prevailed in bourgeois society. It will be possible to have contemplation without inhumanity as soon as the productive forces are freed to the point where men will no longer be engulfed in a practice that one exacts from them, in a practice which then becomes automatic in them. To this day, the trouble with contemplation, with the contemplation that contents itself this side of practice, as Aristotle was the first to develop it as summum bonum, has been that its very indifference to the task of changing the world made it a piece of obtuse practice, a method and an instrumentality. The possible reduction of labor to a minimum could not but have a radical effect on the concept of practice. Whatever insights were bestowed upon a practically freed mankind would differ from a practice that exalts itself ideologically and in one way or another keeps the subjects hustling. A reflection of that prospect falls on contemplation today. The current objection, extrapolated from the, quote, theses on Feuerbach, unquote, that a happy spirit is impermissible amidst the growing misery of the exploding populations of poor countries after the catastrophes that have occurred and in view of those that are impending. This objection has more against it than that it mostly makes a virtue of impotence. True, we cannot really enjoy the spirit anymore because a happiness bound to see through its own non-entity, through the borrowed time it has been granted, would be no happiness. Subjectively, too, it is undermined even where it keeps stirring. There is much to indicate that a knowledge crippled temporarily, at least, in its possible relation to practical change, is not a blessing in itself either. Practice is put off and cannot wait. This is what ails even theory. But when a man can do nothing that will not threaten to turn out for the worst, even if meant for the best, he will be bound to start thinking, and that justifies him as well as the happy spirit. The horizon of such happiness needs by no means be that of a transparent relation to a possible practice to come. There is always something inappropriate to dilatory thinking about practice, even when the postponements are due to naked coercion. Yet he who allows his thinking to be guided by the phrase cui bono may easily spoil everything. What will one day be imposed and bestowed upon a better practice can here and now, according to the warning of utopianism, be no more visualized by thought than practice. Under its own concept, will ever be completely exhausted by knowledge. Without a practical visa, thought should go as much against the facade as possible, should move as far as it is capable of moving, a reality that insulates itself against traditional theory. Even against that which so far has been the best, wants to do so for the sake of the spell that binds it. The eyes it casts upon the subject are so strange that the subject, mindful of its own failure, must not spare the effort of a reply. Paradoxically, it is the desperate fact that the practice that would matter is barred, which grants to thought a breathing spell it would be practically criminal not to utilize. Today, ironically, it profits thought that its concept must not be absolutized. As conduct, it remains a bit of practice, however hidden this practice may be from itself. Yet he who contrasts the literal, sensual happiness as something better with the impermissible one of the spirit, he misunderstands that once historic sublimation has an end, the detached sensual happiness will have a similarly regressive touch, as the relationship of children to food, which digests the adult. Not to be like children, in this sense, is a bit of freedom. And that's the end of video 3 of part 3, chapter 1 of Adorno's Negative Dialectics, part 3 being titled Models, chapter 1 of part 3 being titled Freedom, on the Metacritique of Practical Reason. Thank you so much for listening.